Alone in the Bolivian Amazon after a raft crash, Yossi Ghinsberg reached a point where the pain in his feet was so extreme that he dropped venomous ants onto his own head just to keep moving. By the time Yossi Ghinsberg reached his lowest point, he was no longer thinking like a backpacker, or even like the 21-year-old traveler who had entered the Bolivian Amazon in 1981 with 3 other backpackers. He was alone, exhausted, and in severe pain. According to accounts of his ordeal, the flesh on his feet had begun to openly rot from severe fungal infections. Flesh-eating grubs had burrowed under his skin. Termites fed on his wounds. Every step became a negotiation between pain and survival. At one point, the pain in his feet became so unbearable that he made a desperate calculation. He shook a tree to bring venomous fire ants down onto his own head. The bites and the rush of adrenaline gave him a new pain to focus on, something sharp enough to distract from the agony below. It was not courage in any glamorous sense. It was a stripped-down survival response inside a place that did not care who he had been before he entered it. And yet, this was not even the beginning of the ordeal. To understand how he reached that moment, you have to go back to the accident that scattered the group, and to the river that turned a difficult expedition into a fight to stay alive. In 1981, Yossi Ghinsberg, aged 21, journeyed into the uncharted Bolivian Amazon with 3 other backpackers. The decision placed 4 young travelers inside one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth, where distance, weather, terrain, and injury can turn quickly against anyone. The verified record here is spare, but it is enough to set the stage. This was not a controlled trek with quick access to help. It was a remote passage into jungle territory that the sources describe as uncharted. That detail matters because it meant uncertainty was built into every mile. There was no reliable margin for error. What makes stories like this easy to flatten is hindsight. We know where this leads: to injury, separation, infection, hallucination, and a rescue that came just before death. But at the outset, none of that had happened yet. There was only a young traveler moving deeper into the Amazon with companions beside him. Then, the journey met the river. Near the San Pedro Canyon, a raft crash changed the entire story in seconds. Ghinsberg was swept away by rapids and forced over a waterfall, leaving him separated from his companion. In survival stories, there is often a single instant when the past closes behind a person. For Ghinsberg, that instant was water, current. Part 1, Separation. And the violent loss of contact with the one person nearby. After the crash near the San Pedro Canyon, the river did what rivers in flood and rapids do. It broke apart plans, control, and human proximity. Ghinsberg was carried by the water and forced over a waterfall. When the motion stopped, the most important fact was simple. He was separated from his companion. That separation is the central fracture in the story. Survival in remote terrain is never only about food or shelter. It is also about shared labor, shared decisions, and the psychological fact of not being alone. Once separated, every task becomes heavier. Every mistake becomes more dangerous. Every hour stretches. The sources do not ask us to romanticize what followed. They describe a progression of exposure and decline. Alone in the jungle, Ghinsberg had to keep moving through terrain that was already punishing him physically. The rainforest around him was not an enemy in the human sense. It did not stalk him with intent. But its indifference could be just as lethal. Wetness did not let his skin recover. Insects and parasites turned small vulnerabilities into deeper injuries. Infection advanced. And then one night, even the thin safety of stopping to rest collapsed. Ghinsberg woke to find a jaguar circling him. However damaged his body already was, he still had to react. The question was whether instinct and improvisation would be enough, or whether the jungle had reached another threshold. Part 2, Night Visitor. The image is almost impossible to separate from fear. Waking in darkness to find a jaguar circling. According to the account cited in the record, that is what happened to Yossi Ghinsberg during his time alone in the jungle. He managed to scare the animal away by improvising a flamethrower from a lighter and mosquito repellent. The detail is striking not because it turns the moment into action spectacle, but because it shows how narrow survival had become. He was no longer dealing with one problem at a time. Injury, exhaustion, infection, and fear were overlapping. A single night could demand an immediate response from someone already near collapse. This is where humility, in the deepest sense, enters the story. Not humility as a lesson delivered neatly after the fact, but humility enforced by conditions. In that jungle, there was no room for fantasy about mastery. There was only the next decision, the next burst of improvisation, the next attempt to remain alive. Still, the jaguar encounter did not end the ordeal. If anything, it revealed how exposed he was. Day after day, his body kept deteriorating. Flesh-eating grubs remained under his skin. Termites fed on open wounds. Severe fungal infection continued to destroy the flesh on his feet. As the physical damage mounted. Part 3, 3 weeks alone. Another threat emerged, not from outside him, but from inside his own exhausted mind. Time in extreme survival does not move like ordinary time. The record says nearly 3 weeks passed between the separation and the rescue. Nearly 3 weeks alone in the Bolivian Amazon is long enough for injury to become systemic, for hunger and weakness to narrow thought, and for reality itself to begin slipping. By then, Ghinsberg was hallucinating. That detail matters because it marks the point where survival becomes not only physical endurance, but a struggle to hold onto perception. The body can be failing while the mind begins to misread the world around it. In dense jungle, where direction and distance are already difficult to judge, that is especially dangerous. This is also the section of the story that most resists clean narration. We can list the verified facts, the grubs under the skin, the termites feeding on wounds, the rotting flesh on his feet, the deliberate fire ant stings used as pain distraction, the hallucinations near the end. But those facts do not combine into triumph. They combine into attrition, into someone being reduced, step by step, to the barest instinct to continue. And then, when the process was close to finishing him, the story turned. Not because the jungle relented, and not because he conquered it, but because other people came back into the frame. The rescue would arrive through a friend and an indigenous boatman. Part 4, The Rescue and the Debt. And that fact would shape the rest of Ghinsberg's life long after the wounds healed. Nearly 3 weeks after the separation, Yossi Ghinsberg was rescued on the brink of death. The rescue came from his friend Kevin Gale and an indigenous boatman named Tico Tudela. That phrasing, on the brink of death, is the documentary hinge of the entire story. Without those rescuers, this would likely be remembered very differently, if it were remembered at all. The survival narrative that people now know depends on the decision and ability of others to find him in time. It also reframes the ordeal. Many survival stories get told as solitary contests between one person and nature. But this one does not end in solitude. It ends in relationship. Ghinsberg was not simply a man who endured the jungle. He was a man who was found and saved by people, including an indigenous rescuer whose role matters beyond the final scene. That rescue created a debt Ghinsberg would later describe not as a dramatic slogan, but as something enduring enough to guide action. The jungle had stripped away assumptions of control. The rescue replaced isolation with obligation. The question after surviving was no longer only how he lived through 1981. It was what he would do with the fact that he had been brought back. For years, that answer remained unfinished. Then, more than a decade later, he returned to the community connected to his survival. What followed shifted the story from endurance to reciprocity. In 1992, Ghinsberg returned to the indigenous community that rescued him. He secured a $1.25 million grant from the Inter-American Development Bank to help them build an eco-lodge. That fact turns the story outward. Until this point, the narrative has focused on one body in danger. Now it moves toward a community and a longer timescale. Recovery not as personal healing alone, but as practical partnership. The return was not a symbolic visit disconnected from material change. It led to funding. In 1995, the Chalalan Ecolodge opened as the world's first indigenous-run ecolodge. According to the verified sources, it provided funds for education while protecting vast areas of the Madidi National Park from illegal logging and mining. That outcome is important for two reasons. First, it transformed the meaning of survival. The jungle that nearly killed Ghinsberg did not become a backdrop for revenge, domination, or extraction. Instead, the long-term response helped support an indigenous-run enterprise inside the forest itself. Second, the result was larger than one lodge. The project is documented as protecting vast areas from illegal logging and mining, tying local economic strength to conservation. So the arc of this story is unusual. It begins with a young traveler entering an uncharted Amazon, breaks apart in rapids near San Pedro Canyon, descends through injury, infection, fear, and hallucination, and then reemerges years later as an enterprise rooted in the people who saved him. Part 5: What the Jungle Left Behind. Not every survival story produces gratitude with infrastructure behind it. This one did. There is a temptation, with stories like this, to force a simple lesson onto them. But the verified facts suggest something more grounded. In 1981, a 21-year-old entered the uncharted Bolivian Amazon with 3 other backpackers. After a raft crash near the San Pedro Canyon, he was swept away by rapids and forced over a waterfall, separated from his companion. Alone, he endured severe fungal infections that left the flesh on his feet openly rotting, grubs under his skin, termites feeding on wounds, and at least one night waking to a jaguar circling him. He improvised a way to scare the jaguar away, using a lighter and mosquito repellent. He shook venomous fire ants onto his own head to distract from the pain in his feet. Nearly 3 weeks after the separation, hallucinating and close to death, he was rescued by Kevin Gale and Tico Tudela. Then, in 1992, he returned to the indigenous community that rescued him and secured funding to help build an eco-lodge. In 1995, Chalalan opened as the world's first indigenous-run eco-lodge, providing funds for education and helping protect vast areas of Madidi National Park from illegal logging and mining. That is enough. Enough to show that nature can reduce a person to instinct. Enough to show that survival is often collective, even when the suffering is solitary. And enough to show that what someone builds after catastrophe can matter just as much as the fact that they lived through it. the jungle did not hand back the same person who entered it. The story that followed suggests he understood that and chose to answer survival with gratitude made durable. If this story brought up feelings of fear, trauma, or hopelessness, consider reaching out to a trusted local mental health professional or emergency support service in your area.